Welcome everyone. KCHR has been organized as a part of celebrating the 75th year of independence of the country. KCHR has been organizing a series of academic events. Today we will have a wonderful talk by Professor Ajay Skaria, Professor of Department of History, University of Minnesota, on the topic "Who is Gandhi's neighbor?" Before entering to the session, you are requested to keep your microphone on mute for the duration of the presentation. After the presentation, your suggestions and queries may be entered into the chat box. After the presentation, we will read them out and make clarification for the queries. I invite Professor Adanima for presiding the session.
Thanks, Fasha. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome Professor Ajay Skaria, a very old and very dear friend, other than being an absolutely stellar scholar of modern Indian history. Many here will know both of Ajay's exceedingly important pieces of writing, his two books. The first on the Dangi Fields, which came out in 1999, called Hybrid Histories, Forest Frontiers and Wilderness in Western India. And the second on a very different theme, on Gandhi, Unconditional Equality, Gandhi's Religion of Resistance. Both of these have actually marked a very important space in thinking about questions about marginality, resistance, politics, and also about how to think theoretically about history itself. And I think Ajay's engagement continuously makes historians not just sort of focus on sources and evidence and those manners of writing history. It's also a way of meditating about history writing itself. And I think his contribution in that sense is exceedingly important for that. Now, for many years, he was part of, in its later phase, he was part of the Subaltern Studies Collective before it dissolved. And as part of the collective, he was one of the co-editors of the Subaltern Studies Volume 12, which, as many will remember, had extremely important essays, including those by people like M.S.S. Pandian and others. In today's talk, which Ajay tells me is part of very new work that he is doing, Ajay has termed he has named the talk, Who is Gandhi's Neighbor? It's an intriguing title. And I'm sure all of us look forward very much to hearing what he has to say about this, but questions about citizenship, how do we think about liberty, what are the kinds of questions about rights and duties? Now, as Fasha said earlier, this is a period in our contemporary history when we are constantly being reminded that we are celebrating the 75th year of Indian independence. Now, this is, I think, a very timely moment for us also to step back from simple celebratory forms of thinking about this moment and probably engaging in very detailed and meditative ways of thinking about these questions. So with these few words, let me welcome Ajay to KCHR seminar series. Thank you so much. I think it's very early in the morning for you. Thanks a lot, Ajay.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that wonderful and very generous introduction, Anu. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you, and thank you for organizing this, and thanks Fasha for facilitating it. And it's so nice to see old friends like Sanal again after so long. As Anu was saying, I think it's very important that we step back from a simply celebratory understanding of nationalism, right, of Indian independence. And it's in this spirit that I would like to offer a kind of critical engagement with some of Gandhi's thoughts and tease out some concepts that Gandhi might give us for thinking of our present. As I was also telling Anu, and as Anu mentioned, this is part of some new work I'm doing. It's part of a longish essay. I'm not yet sure what to call it. Possibly we call Who is Gandhi's Neighbor, possibly we call On Democratic Neighborliness, where I basically want to explore the ways in which nationalism is questioned by another conception of place, so to speak. Right? So with those remarks, let me just start. Across Gandhi's writings and actions, a double figure hovers: the neighbor and transforming the neighbor, the friend. Already in 1900 in Hind Swaraj, the editor invokes the figure of the neighbor. He writes there, I'm sure all of you here have read it. I'm so constructed that I can serve only my immediate neighbors, but in my conceit, I pretend to have discovered that I must with my body serve every individual in the universe. In thus attempting the impossible, man comes into contact with different natures, different religions, and is utterly confounded. Right? Again, during the Khilafat movement, Gandhi claims that it is as a neighbor and as a friend that he must support the Muslim demand for the restoration of the Caliphate. And I'm quoting again, "The Musalman is my neighbor. He is in distress. His grievance is legitimate, and it is my bounden duty to help him to secure redress by every legitimate means in my power, even to the extent of losing my life and property. That is the way I can win permanent friendship with Musalmans." Again, as the word Swadeshi enters his vocabulary, he often describes it in terms of the neighbor. Thus, in 1925, he writes that Swadeshi is not antagonistic to anything, but it is the law of charity beginning at home. It is the law of charity which teaches us that if we do not serve our family, our neighbor, we will not be able to serve our distant neighbor. And in 1926, he remarks, one rule of Swadeshi is that in serving people, we should give priority to those who live near us. There is also the opposite rule, that we should serve first those who are distant from us and then those who are near us. Near in the first rule means physically near, and distant in the second rule means distant from us mentally. Right? So I suppose the reason I began with all these quotes is basically to just stress this point that he's making about associating the neighbor with Swadeshi, the neighbor with his politics most broadly, right? And in 1924, and the interesting thing is that as he talks about this, he comes to create a contrast between sovereignly nationalism and neighborly nationalism, so to speak. So in 1924, for example, he writes, "There is no fear of Indian Swadeshi becoming impure or racial, so long as it confines itself principally to khadar and to things which should be manufactured in India. It is not exclusive, but conservative. It is not anti-British or anti-foreign, but pro-Indian by necessity. India must protect her primary industries, even as a mother protects her children against the whole world without being hostile to it." And therefore, he goes on to contrast non-violent nationalism with violent nationalism or sovereign nationalism. Yeah. Now, as we know, in a way, his criticisms seem more resonant than ever today. From its inception, nationalism has striven for the form of the nation state. And by now, the nation state is the vexed source both of our rights and of our oppressions. Most of us are already born as members of nation states. And as you know, there are few fates as disempowering as statelessness, as becoming a refugee. And yet, sovereign nationalism, even in its most democratic...
Ajay, could you speak a little slower? Thank you.
Sure. And yet the problem is that sovereign nationalism, even when it is democratic, it cannot eschew the violence involved in sovereignty. I put it this way because the phrase sovereign nationalism, because in the phrase sovereign nationalism, the violence is borne by the adjective sovereign. Of course, it's true that democratic forms of sovereign nationalism are less violent than non-democratic forms. But even democratic forms of sovereign nationalism remain marked by the violence of sovereignty. Externally, as we know, they structurally exclude those who are not part of the nation. And this is the violence that we see inflicted most of all on the refugee. Internally, they're structurally inclined towards majoritarianism. even though what makes sovereign nationalism democratic is precisely that it's at least capable of questioning its majoritarianism. So I suppose what I'm trying to stress is that sovereignty is central to the violence of nationalism. And this is something that we are constantly engaged dealing with. And Gandhi's invocation of Swadeshi is a manifestation of quite another approach, one that in some senses transforms nationalism by delinking it from sovereignty, right? In a way, this is unsurprising. More than any other leader associated with the nationalist movement, he conceptualizes nonviolence as the relinquishment of sovereignty and mastery. Soon after his return to India, he conceptualizes, he starts distinguishing, as you know, between true Swaraj, or what he as a satyagrahi strove for, and parliamentary Swaraj, or the democratic form of sovereign nationalism that he as the principal leader of the Congress strove for. And true Swaraj is what he constantly claims that he's more committed to. And as he tries to think of what he calls true Swaraj, he draws on the figure of the neighbor and of the friend. That is why I'd like to take up the question today: who is Gandhi's neighbor? Right? It seems to me that to ask this question is to approach this question of also what is a nationalism that is no longer centered around the neighbor, around sovereignty. I should stress before I go on that I asked this question, who is Gandhi's neighbor, in the spirit of thinking with rather than thinking about. Yeah, and I can come back to the distinction between thinking with and thinking about in the discussion. But very briefly, what marks thinking about, which is also what we call critique, is a relationship of mastery with what we encounter. We are sovereign over what we ask about. We approach it in a spirit which keeps us invulnerable to it. We make it into a what about which we can ask questions. That spirit of thinking about is the crux of what is sometimes called disciplinary knowledge, right? So if you're to ask who is Gandhi's neighbor in a disciplinary spirit, then we are effectively asking, what is Gandhi's concept of the neighbor? What is the sociology of the neighbor? Now, the shadow of the disciplinary question will hover over what I'm going to say, but that is not the question I shall be asking. Anu, is this slow enough? Yeah?
Yes, absolutely. Perfect.
Okay. So the way I ask the question, who is Gandhi's neighbor, is shaped rather by the traditions of thinking with. What marks thinking with, what distinguishes it, is a certain vulnerable equality to that which we encounter in thinking, a certain possibility of ourselves being addressed by and implicated in the entity we inquire about, right? Put differently, whereas in thinking about or critique, what we contemplate does not contribute to our thought. When we think with something, it contributes to our thought. Of course, needless to say, such equality, such vulnerable equality is not possible with everything or everybody. Some traditions of thought are so hostile to any aspiration for a vulnerable equality that they must be relinquished or annihilated. This is why we can think with only some of what or who we encounter. But anyway, with those preliminary remarks, what I want to stress is that when we think with Gandhi, the question of who is Gandhi's neighbor appears differently. It appears as a companion on our way to the phenomenological and moral question, who is our neighbor? And how can our neighborliness be democratic? Yeah. I should also add, in case it is not already clear, that to think with is not to follow, and it is even less to agree, right? Rather, it is to find ourselves with a companion with whom we have a fractious but usually indispensable relationship. And if we approach Gandhi in this way, as a companion on our way to the messianic destination, the impossible destination of democratic neighborliness, then we could start by observing that how Gandhi comes to the figure of the neighbor is by no means clear, right? His conversations in the 1890s with his missionary friends would certainly have led to his reflecting on the biblical injunction, love thy neighbor as thyself. And part of what happens in the 1890s is that he engages also with the Gita, the Ramcharitmanas, and picks up analogies with these texts with that injunction, right? And by the 1900s, love thy neighbor as thyself has emerged as this key theme in his writing, yeah. Which is why he is also emphasizing the neighbor so much in his Raj, right? So in a way, Gandhi thinks he's only repeating the age-old injunction, which he finds both in the Bible and analogues in the Gita elsewhere, which he takes to be therefore religious rather than broadly Christian, rather than only Christian. But the strange thing is that in that very repetition, a singularity opens up. Love thy neighbor as thyself. This injunction turns out to have a phenomenological and a moral dimension. Right? I'm distinguishing between the phenomenological and the moral, and I'll come back to that distinction in a moment. Phenomenologically, neighborliness is for Gandhi an experience into which beings like us, finite beings who ask about what we are, about who we are always thrown. There is nothing right or wrong about this phenomenological experience of neighborliness. It just is the condition of our being. At the same time, it turns out to also be an experience which is especially repressed and obscured by what he calls modern civilization. So that's the phenomenological dimension. Gandhi's also got, when he picks up the injunction, love thy neighbor as thyself, he also transforms it, because even as he says the same thing, he's saying it in a different context, in a context where citizenship and its rhetoric of equality has come to be. So effectively, what I should be arguing is that morally, that injunction becomes a political friendship and a democratic neighborliness. All the more so at this historical moment when it is both challenged and leavened by the democratic sovereignty involved in the nation state. Right? So given the limited time available, and given the fact that these framing remarks have already taken so long, here I want to take the remaining time to only give you a flavor, first of Gandhi's phenomenology of the neighbor, and second of his morality of the neighbor, that is to say, of his thinking of political friendship or democratic neighborliness. So these are the two things that I'll do today. Okay, so with that, let me first move to the first section of the essay, which is on the phenomenology of the neighbor. If we are to trace our way through this phenomenology, then a helpful point would be the episode narrated in My Experiments with Truth. Right? I know all of you in the audience will have read this book, but just to refresh your memory, likely somewhere in 1892, the 23-year-old Gandhi, only recently returned from England, is told by his elder brother Lakshmidas that the Kathiawad political agent, Charles Ollivant, with whom Gandhi had a quote-unquote trifling acquaintance in England, is prejudiced against his brother. Right? So the brother suggests that, and I quote Gandhi now, that I should avail myself of the friendship and, putting in a good word on his behalf, approach and try and disabuse the political agent of his prejudice, unquote. Gandhi did not like the idea, but could not refuse his brother. And I quote again, I went to the officer much against my will. I knew I had no right to approach him and was fully conscious that I was compromising self-respect. The officer was stiff. Surely you have not come here to abuse their acquaintance. Have you? Appeared to be the meaning of that stiffness. When Gandhi broached the subject, the officer asked him to leave. When Gandhi persisted, the officer called on his peon to physically put Gandhi out of the room. Right? Now, there surely was some racism in the political agent's response, though Gandhi does not dwell on this. What he takes away from the event is that he had been put in a quote-unquote false position, and he resolves never to put himself in such a position or to quote-unquote exploit friendship in this way. The friendship that Gandhi is here renouncing belongs to a distinctive phenomenology, that of neighborliness. Right? Now, what I mean by neighborliness, we can begin to approach by, by way of the disciplinary rendition of it, offered in Benedict Anderson's classic Imagined Communities. There, Anderson activates the long-standing disciplinary distinction between two ways of imagining a community, particularistic and abstract. Anderson describes these particularistic communities only in passing, and he says that what he describes them as constituted by indefinitely stretchable nets of kinship and clientship. And I quote him, to the question, who is the Count of X? The answer would have been not a member of the aristocracy, but the Lord of X, the uncle of Baron de Y, or a client of the Duke de Z, right? Now, this phrase, particularistic communities, this is often how the phenomenological world of neighbors appears to disciplinary knowledge, right? And if we are to recuperate the figure of the neighbor from this knowledge, then we could say that neighborliness involves the primacy of relations of who over relations of what, or put differently, of proximate relations over general traits. Such proximity, which we find ourselves thrown into because of our nature as finite beings, is what Gandhi stresses when he invokes the neighbor. Thus, in Hind Swaraj, the Gujarati phrases that he translates into English as neighbors are suggestive. It's not simply Swadeshi, which would have been the closest equivalent, but also several other phrases. Aspas vasta manaso, or those who reside nearby, aspas na loko, aspas na manaso, all of them basically stressing this emphasis on nearby. So as in the etymology of the English word too, neighbors are here primarily those who are nearby around us, right? Whether this nearness be physical, as was often the case in the societies that Gandhi sought to create, the intentional societies, or topological, as in his relationship with the British, or with other physically distant groups and individuals he corresponded with. And as the emphasis on around us suggests, we do not choose this proximity or nearness. It is what we find ourselves thrown into. Put differently, the figure of the neighbor has its source in our nature as limited beings. We have neighbors, are neighbors, because we are limited and finite beings. This limit, the editor emphasizes already in Hind Swaraj, right? In the phrase we saw about immediate neighbors, right? And what I want to do quickly is emphasize 6 aspects of this proximate relationship. Yeah. First, as should be evident, this proximity is not only singular, it is plural, right? It is about proximity with others, not with an other. It is of the very nature of finitude that we do not have only one neighbor. We are finite in so many ways and so constitutively that we have many neighbors. Indeed, the emphasis on the plurality of neighbors, or loco, as Gandhi says, is central to Gandhi. So the question is, in a sense, no longer who is my neighbor, it is rather who are my neighbors. Okay. The second dimension that I want to stress is again implicit in the word aspas, and this is the intertwining of familiarity and strangeness, of what in a word could be called prejudice. Involved in familiarity, which includes more relations than the intimate and the familial, is a distinctive repetition. Whether we cherish or are repulsed by the familiar, we know it through repeated interaction. Right? So that to be familiar with a neighborhood is to know which shops to frequent. Sometimes you prefer a shop that may have higher prices than one that one may nevertheless frequent for other reasons, etc., etc. You know, and I should also stress that familiarity is the modality through which relations of preference or aversion are activated. You know, and the friendship of the kind that Gandhi talked about, whether intimate, pleasure-driven, or the transactional friendship that he tried with Olivant, right, are amongst the dimensions of this world of familiarity and prejudice, right? Now, implicit in familiarity, and though we often forget this, is also strangeness, right? Long back, George Simmel remarked that the phenomenon of the stranger, and I'm quoting him now, may be succinctly formulated as follows. The distance within the relationship indicates that one who is close by is remote, but a strangeness indicates that one who is remote is near. The state of being a stranger is, of course, a completely positive relation. It is a specific form of interaction, right? The inhabitants of Sirius are not exactly strangers to us, at least not in the sociological sense as we are considering it. In that sense, they do not exist for us at all. They are beyond being far and near. The stranger is an element of the group itself, not unlike the poor and sundry inner enemies. An element of membership within the group involves being both outside it and confronting it. You know, and I would add that what distinguishes familiarity from habit is precisely that habit evacuates strangeness. It is antagonistic to the strange, right? This language of strangeness and prejudice, this language of familiarity and strangeness, of prejudice, you know, can cause acute discomfort amongst those of us committed to a more social and historical approach. Right? And I just want to foreground this a bit, right? Because it's very striking how Gandhi's politics is often centered on acknowledging a certain strangeness, right? Which we will find actually quite discomforting, and I'll just stress how discomforting. Gandhi contrasts on one occasion his own acknowledgement of prejudice with the quote-unquote temporal view of the law. And I'm quoting him now: "I want to respect even prejudice, for I realize that what may appear to me prejudice may be enlightenment to others. But these are matters where the aid of the law cannot be sought. The law can only take a temporal view of the questions that come before it. It cannot recognize the agamas, the scriptures, upholding thieving. I have at the ashram neighbors who honestly believe that thieving is an occupation enjoined by God to them as a caste. I respect their prejudice, but the law does not. I am here not giving a hypothetical case. I'm quoting from actual experience." When I turn to neighborliness as a morality, that is to say, to democratic neighborliness or political friendship, I shall draw out the tensions and aporias involved in respecting prejudice. But what I want to stress for now is neighborliness as a phenomenology, and the way that here prejudice is constitutive of the neighbor, right? Gandhi's reference here is likely to the Chara community who resided in the Sabarmati area, and from other correspondence that Gandhi has, that others write to Gandhi, etc. We know that there were several thefts that take place in the ashram, etc. And the question comes up over and again of how to deal with this. Right? Now, a disciplinary sensibility or a sensibility centered on thinking about would seek to contextualize such theft. So say, for example, when we look at it would teach us to examine critically the processes that led to the Charas being designated as a criminal tribe. It would situate their behavior within cultural or political or social norms. It would perhaps question the very concept of theft in their context, right? So in that sense, it would basically, help us contextualize, right? Always contextualize, right? So this is why, even though anthropological traditions talk of rendering the familiar strange and the strange familiar, but this whole process is about attenuating otherness. Indeed, one of the most damning criticisms that we can make of any disciplinary work is that it others its subject, right? And yet, the interesting thing is that Gandhi others the Charas in profoundly disturbing ways. They are, in his account, thieves because of their very scriptures. Such othering is not an exception, right? Neither in Gandhi's writings nor in the phenomenology of neighborliness. Indeed, othering is often a very crucial dimension of neighborly relationships. The neighbor is precisely the familiar other, the stranger in or by whom. And as for Gandhi himself, he is, need one say, after all these years of excoriating critiques, deeply prejudiced, right? The Charas are no exception. He makes similar remarks about Muslims, Dalits, women, and other communities, right? India, so, and othering is a constant feature of him, of his writings. Yeah. So I could get into more examples, but I don't want to take too much time. I'll just skip that. What I want to stress is that from a historical and sociological perspective, this othering is very difficult to make sense of. As that perspective has become more hegemonic from around the 1980s, we, myself included, have channeled considerable energy into ferreting out, both obvious and insidious examples of othering as a form of domination, right? So this is why I think this othering raises very, very interesting questions. And very quickly, let me just ask, what is enabled by the othering that Gandhi undertakes here, right? How can such othering offer a promise for a more democratic politics than that involved in historicizing, than that involved in the progressive injunction, always historicize, right? Let me offer a first pass here to this as a question, as an answer to this question. Contrast the neighbor with the concepts of the human and the citizen, which are the most inclusive concepts of what Gandhi calls, quote unquote, modern civilization, of our modernity, right? I mean, after all, if we want to be most inclusive, these are the terms that we'll most often invoke, right? The citizen, the human being, even more inclusive than the citizen. Sorry, just starting on my second cup of coffee. But both these concepts, citizen and human, have constitutive outsides, right? Whereas the neighbor has no constitutive outside. Let me explain what I mean. The human is defined always by contrast to the non-human, right? This opposition cannot be overcome. Similarly, the citizen is defined always by relationship to the non-citizen, whether refugee or citizen of another state. This opposition may shift to include those who were left out at one time or the other, but it cannot in principle be overcome. Right? More to the point still, both citizen and the human have the neighbor as their constitutive outside. This is because the neighbor belongs to a different epistemic world from that of the citizen and the human. Conceptually, the latter inhabit a world that in its uniformity is neither distant nor near, is distance-less and nearness less, as to draw on Gmail. As such, becoming a citizen or neighbor involves repressing or obscuring the world of the neighbor, allowing it a legitimate space only in the private sphere. Right? By contrast, the neighbor has very labile boundaries. So much so that we cannot talk of it as a concept. So much so that we cannot talk of it as a concept of the constitutive outside. It only has a contingent outside. True, distant strangers are not neighbors, but they remain potential neighbors. So too, even though neighborliness may be a constitutive outside of the concepts of the human and the citizen, the converse does not hold. It remains entirely possible to activate and so undo, for the neighbor to activate and so undo the distancelessness of the citizen and the human. In other words, conceptually, there is nothing who or what cannot be included in the figure of the neighbor. In the figure of the neighbor, we encounter a conceptual promiscuity and inclusiveness, which is nevertheless not generalizing. It does not, that is to say, proceed by creating an abstract criterion by which others can be included. The neighbor as a concept, as a concept to be precise, is defined by just this combination of empirical boundedness. I only have a finite number of neighbors, and conceptual promiscuity. A stone can be a neighbor, the inhabitants of Sirius can be a neighbor, etc. Right? Precisely this phenomenological combination makes the neighbor such a promising point of departure for a democratic politics. So I've made 2 points about the neighbor so far: proximity and proximity, then also, emphasize prejudice. And the third point I want to stress is that there is nothing non-violent about the neighbor. I absolutely want to stress this, because I think we have to be very clear about this, that actual violence or its specter is constitutive of the neighborly relations that we find ourselves thrown into. Gandhi acknowledges this, even if reluctantly, right? In the crucial chapter 16 of Swadeshi called Brute Force, chapter 16, it is by drawing attention to the strife between neighbors that the editor develops his argument about the necessity of non-violence. And he explicitly says, I do not suggest Hindus and Mohammedans will never fight. Two brothers living together often do so. We shall sometimes have our heads broken. Such a thing ought not be necessary, but all men are not equitable. When people are in a rage, they do many foolish things. These we have to bear. Yeah. At the same time, as I remarked earlier, Gandhi is often tempted to minimize in the implications of violence, right? And this I think is quite indefensible, because that this violence, I don't think there is any way to say that the violence of neighborliness is less than the violence of modern civilization. It is more finite, and that is something we can turn to again in the question when we come to the discussions. Let me turn now to the fourth aspect of the phenomenological figure of the neighbor as this neighbor emerges from Gandhi's writings, right? Which is to say that the centrality of violence attracts us to what might otherwise escape attention. That while the most apparent manifestation of the neighbor is finitude and proximity and plurality, what gives meaning especially to finitude and proximity is a certain vulnerability, right? Using that word in its most capacious sense. In other words, our neighbors are all those who, or all that which, all those who, or all that which we are vulnerable to, or who we make vulnerable to us, regardless of whether this vulnerability be physical or affective, regardless of whether it be privative or actively embraced, regardless of whether it be real or imagined, current or retrospective or prospective. What this means is that the experience of neighborliness has often been the strongest amongst the most disinherited and disprivileged, right? Those who cannot escape a privative vulnerability to their surroundings. But historically, at least before the consolidation of modernity, even the privileged could hardly escape the experience of neighborliness. Even their privilege, after all, was dependent and arose within the problematic of neighborliness. For privilege took the form of honor and was always prone to being disrupted by the experience of dishonor. The accompanying apprehension of vulnerability is what historically made most oppressor castes experience the oppressed castes around them as neighbors. For however thoroughgoing the domination of the oppressed caste was, there was always the putative vulnerability of pollution or of the disruption of services that the oppressed castes were presumed to provide, right? Historically provided often. So, and I said historically, and I stressed this because what I mean by this is that with modernity, or with what Gandhi calls modern civilization, there emerges a greater opportunity for the dominant to exit the problematic of neighborliness. It is as they exit this problematic of neighborliness, this phenomenology of neighborliness, that they give voice to and put together its constitutive outside, citizenry and human rights. Both of these phenomena, both of these figures, the citizen and the human, are centered not around the honor and humiliation problematic that marks neighborliness, but around the dignity shared by sovereign citizens and humans. Of course, this remains a fragile exit, to say the least. For Cheek by Joel, with this world that speaks the language of rights, is its underside, an entire world constituted by oppression, an entire world where neighborliness and the honor humiliation problematic continue to prevail. And not only Cheek and by Joel socially, as in other persons, but also Cheek and Joel in the same persons, who must inhabit simultaneously the worlds of neighborhood and citizenship, repressing the former for the latter. It is only if the dominant could extirpate all possibility of even a smidgen of independent action by the dominated that the latter's potential neighborliness could be staved off. But this possibility of independent action cannot be ruled out for beings like us, not even for the most oppressed amongst us. Indeed, that possibility cannot be ruled out for anything that has life. Arguably, it cannot be ruled out even for that which is lifeless, as the phenomenon of climate change should suffice to remind us. So even if we abandon the comportment of the neighbor, this does not mean that we no longer have neighbors. Rather, it means that we fail to recognize our neighbors, perhaps actively repress awareness of them, as happens all the time in our relations with animals and things. Perhaps part of the terror that Americans experienced on and after 9/11 was precisely this discovery of new neighbors, and neighbors that they did not particularly want. Right? So that is I've now gone through 4 dimensions. The fifth, since I'm already taken up around half an hour, more than half an hour, I will skip the 5th dimension of neighborliness, which was about patriotism, right, as distinct from nationalism, right. And what I wanted to stress in that point was that patriotism imagines a neighborly community where one can claim ties to other members, even if these ties have to be routed through myriad intermediate linkages. And as you know, Chris Bailey has written very suggestively of this kind of patriotism. And he has also pointed to, and I think something to stress is that it continues to be at play in modern nationalisms. Yeah. What I would like to do now is turn to the essay's 2nd section, which explores 5 key aspects of the morality of the neighbor, right? Or what it tries to make, what it means to try and practice a politics of neighborliness. Because as you can see from all that I've been saying, there is nothing, how do I say, the neighbor is a figure who is very, very different from the citizen and the human. right? But there's nothing necessarily non-violent about the neighbor as such. Yeah. And in doing this, I'm skipping over some key sections, which I'll just give you a very quick summary of, so that you know that, I'm not just making this contrast, how I reach the contrast. Yeah. What I do is, in the sections that I'm skipping, is I look at how the biblical injunction, love thy neighbor as thyself, reworks the phenomenological world of neighborliness. That's the third section. The fourth section looks at sovereign nationalism and how it foregrounds an abstract equality, and how that is quite in contrast with neighborliness. A fifth section looks at the contrast between morality and ethics, morality being the envisioning of right and wrong within the problematic of neighborliness, within the phenomenology of the neighbor, and ethics being the envisioning of right and wrong within the order of the human and the citizen, right? And it's then that I shift to looking at in the sixth section, I look at what is democratic neighborliness in terms of an equality of vulnerability. The model for this is provided by friendship, of which the key characteristic, after all, of our relationship with friends is that we are equal with friends. Right? This is what distinguishes friendship from all other forms of intimacy. And I suggest that part of what Gandhi does is try and articulate and imagine a political friendship. Such a political friendship or democratic neighborliness never rejects sovereign nationalism, because sovereign nationalism in its democratic forms, such as republican democracy, remains the most egalitarian and just form of sovereignty. But even though it does not reject it, it relinquishes it, right? And what I want to do in the time that remains is really look at what is involved in relinquishment. So let me get back to reading out. So this will-centered form politics, even in its most democratic form of the categorical imperative and republican democracy, is antithetical to democratic neighborliness, because democratic neighborliness relinquishes the will. But how then to describe the relationship between these two? Here, the answer turns out to be tautological. Relinquishment itself is the relationship. We can take our hint from the fact that Gandhi both led the struggle for parliamentary Swaraj or republican democracy and insisted that this was not the Swaraj he sought. As this suggests, he was not rejecting parliamentary Swaraj or political democracy. He could not. He was too acutely aware that most Indians around him desired it. Arguably, he desired it himself. To simply reject that desire for parliamentary Swaraj would have been to exercise a willed relationship over it. The point really is to not desire it. So he sought to cultivate a discipline among satyagrahis that would enable them to relinquish that desire itself and to turn towards a democratic politics centered around non-willing. Only such a relinquishment would be in keeping with the logic of the politics of non-willing. For to will relinquishment would be to violate the very character of relinquishment. But what is this relinquishment? Let us not be misled by the passivity the term seems to imply. Relinquishment is an intense modality of action. It is the enactment of the equality involved in satyagraha or ahimsa, or to resort to the conceptual names of the same phenomenon of democratic neighborliness or political friendship. Only through the enactment of this other equality can the equality of citizenship be relinquished. The enactment of this other equality, however, must work through formidable challenges. To begin with, there is the inevitable tension between Satyagraha's aspiration for the equality of all being and the obdurate inequalities of the social relations they are thrown into. Put differently, while Satyagrahis might strive for an equality of vulnerability, while Satyagrahis may strive for an equality of vulnerability, they live in a world of profound social inequalities. These inequalities cut both ways. Satyagrahis are dominated in some relations, but there are structural and institutional ways in which even the most committed Satyagrahis will always find themselves oppressing and exploiting. They can exit some of these relations in which they're dominant, but they cannot exit all, right? So satyagrahis have to work through the question how to enact political friendship. Now, enacting this equality of political friendship is especially challenging because there can be no institutionalizable protocols for navigating the tension between the injunction to equality and the existence of actual inequality. I mean, if you think of citizenly equality, the emphasis on the rights on the rights of citizens provides some institutionalizable protocols for navigating it, right? In the absence of institutionalizable protocols, this equality requires satyagrahis to fashion different components of political friendship for each cluster they encounter. That is to say, they must constantly ask what kind of relation of power is at work in this cluster of relations, and what comportment of offering non-privative vulnerability can transform it into a political friendship. With this question, Gandhi struggled memorably and instructively. It is possible to identify at least 6 different clusters that relations of power take and corresponding comportments of non-privative vulnerability. Some of these comportments that he adopts are quite troubling in their implications, while 2 we can now clearly see must push relinquishment in directions where it relinquishes itself and yields to another comportment, that of annihilation. So let me just list out these 6 comportments and I'll end. I'm sorry it's taking slightly longer than I'd hoped, but so first there is the question of what vulnerability can the dominated offer to the dominant so as to transform it into a political friendship, right? And it is in this context that Gandhi comes up with his most celebrated formulation, conceptualization, which is that of civil disobedience, right? And you can think of civil disobedience as an encounter between the ideologies of citizenship and democratic neighborliness, right? Amongst the most crucial aspects of modernity, after all, is that neighborly relations, as I've been saying, relations, come to be increasingly dominated by abstract ones. This does not mean that neighborly relations are erased. They never can be. But it does mean that they could be repressed, right? Become increasingly recessive or optional, as I was just stressing, right? The dominated do not have that luxury. If there were such a thing as a pure capitalism, then perhaps it would be possible to be dominated without experiencing a neighborly relationship with the dominant. Since such a thing is absolutely impossible, the dominated always experience the dominant as neighbors, those who they are vulnerable to. As with myriad relations historically, this is a privative vulnerability, whether in a highly visible way, as with slavery, or in more quiet ways, as when the putative equality of citizenship is undercut in the everyday interactions between those from minority and majority communities. It is to acknowledge the neighborly and phenomenological dimension of domination that we often resort to the word oppression. In this context, at the heart of civil disobedience was an audacious strategy, challenging the colonial ideology of citizenship by bringing colonial and liberal ideology of citizenship by bringing out and democratizing the neighborliness that always undergirds it. The neighborliness is brought out in the very act of quietly breaking laws without resorting to an alternative language of citizenship. In other words, by revealing to the colonizers that they too are vulnerable, are neighbors to those whom they dominate. Further, by accepting the punishment for breaking the laws, satyagrahis practices surrender without subordination with the colonizers. They accept a non-privative vulnerability. This is why I say it is a democratic neighborliness. Second, there is the question of what vulnerability the dominant can offer to the dominated so as to transform their relationship to a political friendship. So remember, we have so far dealt with what vulnerability the dominated can offer to the dominant. Right? Now I'm flipping things around and I'm asking the other question, what can the dominant offer to the dominated, right? As a form of political friendship. As a member of the dominant caste, this question Gandhi encounters especially sharply in the context of the intimate oppression involved in caste. And what he conceives of in response as a non-privative vulnerability is especially troubling. He attempts a penance that sacralizes the untouchable caste, revering them as Harijan or children of God. More broadly, he insists that the term quote-unquote Harijan as a figure who offers service exemplifies what is most central to Hinduism. The extended interpretation of Hinduism, this extended interpretation of Hinduism is what Lalit Batra insightfully calls the Bhangiization of Hinduism in his ongoing dissertation at the University of Minnesota. Unsurprisingly, this reworking of Hinduism found little purchase amongst dominant castes. When they took up the term Harijan, they most often entirely drained it of the reverence with which Gandhi had sought to imbue it. It even sometimes became one more derogatory term in their arsenal of violence and discrimination. As for Gandhi himself, while he vigorously fought explicit forms of discrimination against oppressed castes, his own attitude towards them in social relations remained notoriously paternalistic. Right? The entire process as it unfolded was, as D.R. Nagaraj famously pointed out, capable of having only one hero, the dominant caste penitent, Gandhi. Right? Relatedly, for the oppressed caste, indeed, the entire process was effectively most often nothing but a reliving of the trauma of disprivilege and oppression. Arguably, this too is why Ambedkar repudiated and highlighted the term Harijan with such ferocity. So there was something grievously inadequate, both in conceptualization and execution, about Gandhi's answer to the question of how the dominant are to practice political friendship with those who have historically borne the brunt of their intimate oppression and continue to bear its after effects. But that inadequacy only throws the question itself into sharper relief. Since almost all of us are dominant in some context or the other, and since our domination is most often experienced as neighborly by the dominated, this is not a question that just the 1% or the 20% need to concern themselves with. All the same, it is not a question we have paid much attention to. We often take the answer to be straightforward, offer allyship as well as material and social reparation. That should be a bare minimum, of course. And amongst the problems with Gandhi's responses was that he did not do this. But by itself, offering reparation, offering allyship would only put in place a political democracy, not a political friendship. Political friendship also requires something more from the dominant. It requires reparation for oppression. It requires what Gandhi calls penitence or repentance, or what we who have come to prefer more neutral language might wish to describe as moral reparation. How should the dominant offer this moral reparation or non-privative vulnerability to the historical dominated? For those seeking to nurture traditions of political friendship, perhaps few questions are as urgent to think of as this one. Third, there is a question of how political friendship is to be cultivated with social intimates, those who do not necessarily know us in intimate personal relations, but who nevertheless find themselves bearing a love for us. Through the refashioning from the 1990s, from the 1900s of ascetic traditions, Gandhi created, as we know, an immense world of social intimates. And his effort was to make this a world of political friendship. And this is the context in which he emphasizes fasting. And we can come back again to fasting if we want to, later. But for now, since I'm again trying to make sure that I don't take too much more time, I will move to the fourth aspect. There is a question of what vulnerability can be offered to create and sustain social friendship with those, political friendship with those who might regard us as their social enemies, or at least as opposed to them, right? And here, I could remind you of Gandhi's emphasis on friendship in terms of, the way he tried to offer a friendship to the Muslim community during the Khilafat movement. But what I really want to end with are the last two, right? Which is where we come to the question of annihilation. Fifth, there is a question on which reading Gandhi offers less direct help, but on which his failure is itself revealing. Earlier, in addressing the question of how the dominated could offer political friendship to the dominant, I dwelt on the confrontation between two ways of claiming equality: the ideology of citizenship on the one hand, and the ideology of democratic neighborliness on the other hand. But what where the confrontation is somewhat different? What where the practitioners of democratic neighborliness encountered those who refused to countenance the very possibility of their equality? The most ready example of this would be Nazism, which Martin Buber writes about, and Martin Buber writes about this confrontation very powerfully, which refused to acknowledge the humanity of the Jews it massacred, which often treated them not even as monsters, but merely as objects. Another quite a different example could surely be the caste order, which is a particularly violent instantiation of neighborly relations, right? For the dominant caste profess ritual vulnerability to the dominated caste, and this very claim becomes the reason for inflicting a vicious violence on the dominated caste, a violence which is simultaneously economic, political, social, and personal, and which proceeds through a characteristically neighborly mechanism, humiliation. So, could the dominated caste have offered civil disobedience to the dominant? The most famous satyagraha by Dalits, that in Mahad, which Ambedkar led in 1927, failed, not least because of Gandhi's refusal to support it. But it is also unlikely that Gandhi's support for a civil disobedience movement by the oppressed caste would have saved the dominant caste. Certainly, by the time of the Dandi Salt March, as Tridip Surud argues, Gandhi himself was being treated by many oppressor caste Gujaratis as an untouchable. No longer welcome in their homes, even as they honored him publicly, and being relegated during the Dandi March itself to staying overnight, either in public buildings such as schools, or being hosted in temporary grass huts, which were later burnt by the dominant caste so as to avoid being polluted by him. I do not wish to suggest that neighborly violence can never be redressed by the democratic neighborliness involved in civil disobedience. But certainly, given the immense difficulty of civil disobedience against caste as a quintessentially neighborly form of violence, perhaps relinquishment must here relinquish itself, yield to another comportment, annihilation. Certainly, also, after 1927, Gandhi himself came to be convinced that the satyagraha of civil disobedience would not work against dominant caste. This is why he called for the annihilation of caste. What is annihilation? As comportments, annihilation and relinquishment have a parallax relation. Clearly, Ambedkar does not assume that everything he is critical of is to be annihilated. For example, even though he is sharply critical of political democracy and republican democracy, he does not call for its annihilation. Annihilation is a proper response, rather, to a distinctive kind of phenomenon, that which does not countenance even the possibility of equality. Here we see also its difference from relinquishment, where relinquishment is the relationship with that which we cannot not want. Annihilation is the relationship with that which we absolutely cannot want. In both cases, cannot not want or cannot want, the wanting is a desire that has a moral dimension. One cannot not want justice, one cannot want injustice. Ambedkar cannot not want political democracy because it is driven by the desire for equality, albeit a fictional equality. He absolutely cannot want caste because it is nothing but graded inequality. True, unlike relinquishment, annihilation does involve willed and sovereign acts. For example, the criminalization in the constitution of explicit forms of caste violence, such as boycott. Still, caste violence is also a set of dispositions that are both social and inscribed in the individual bodies of the perpetrators and the perpetrated. As such, This disposition cannot be annihilated by a sovereign act. Sovereign acts of disciplining citizens, such as a progressive state might resort to, not even sovereign acts of self-discipline can ever entirely snuff out internalized disposition. So far more than sovereign acts, annihilation requires a slow and long cultivation of the self and other, both as individuals and communities. It is this multi-generational and multi-pronged annihilation that Ambedkar describes with the slogan, educate, agitate, organize. Such organizing requires also, of course, trying to mobilize the resources of the state, which is to say of sovereignty and the will. But that does not obviate the need for an annihilation that is not sovereign or willed, and that requires instead the cultivation of a certain self-discipline. Why call the relationship between annihilation and relinquishment a parallax one? Because neither Ambedkar nor Gandhi are, in this context at least, will-bearing subjects of the sort who can move without remainder between these comportments. As such, they remain marked by where they began from, what they are thrown into. Gandhi begins from the relinquishment of parliamentary Swaraj of political democracy. Ambedkar begins from the annihilation of caste. Gandhi moves reluctantly but inexorably to the annihilation of caste. Ambedkar moves reluctantly but inexorably to the relinquishment of political democracy. So even when both adopt the quote-unquote same comportment, carry out the quote-unquote the same action, the annihilation of caste cannot be to Gandhi what it is to Ambedkar, nor can the relinquishment of political democracy be to Ambedkar what it is to Gandhi. Sixth, and this is my last remark before I end, the annihilation in this sense allows us to reframe one of the most intriguing and underdeveloped of the comportments of political friendship, that involved in Swadeshi. As Gandhi stressed over and again, Swadeshi in his sense had nothing in common with the exclusionary Swadeshi of the mainstream nationalist movement. His Swadeshi was centered around the constructive program, and his effort was at a social movement to not just relinquish structural domination, but to do so in a manner that embraces human finitude, specifically the neighbor and the most marginal and the oppressed amongst neighbors. The most famous movement of this aspect of the Swadeshi movement was Khadi, but there were several other dimensions, including education, right? And as we know, the Swadeshi movement failed completely, thoroughly, right? This failure was surely in part because the program, as Gandhi pushed it, remained purely constructive rather than annihilatory. Indeed, as his contemporaries on the left, including Ambedkar, forcefully pointed out, the program did not challenge the forms of domination, frontally or even elliptically. All too often, it seemed to work with dominant groups and oppressor castes, depending on their largesse. And yet, at a time when climate change has given a new salience to the emphasis on human finitude, has aggressively politicized old ideas such as sustainable development by imparting to them a new degrowth twist, the emphasis on the neighbors in their finitude is especially resonant. What would be an annihilatory program for our times? This is a question that is with us. And in addressing this question, as also the framing question of what political friendship is, Gandhi remains an indispensable interlocutor, even if our answers often cannot be the same as his, even if our answers will often be parallax to his. Thank you. I'll stop here. Sorry for taking so long.
Thank you so much, Ajay, for what's the word that I'm looking for? It's a really provocative reading of some aspects of both Gandhi and Ambedkar that one is familiar with, but also a very dense and nuanced way of unpacking specific kinds of ideas, which were sort of laying out here in different kinds of shades, and it's sort of unpeeling it slowly. So let me, peeling it off slowly. So let me stop here and remind our audience that normally we ask people to type in their questions, but since it's quite late, we have picked this time largely for keeping in mind Ajay's convenience. It's very early in the morning. So if people wish to ask a question directly, could they just raise their hands and I'll call on them? And if you could keep your questions brief, that would be great. So if you wish to ask questions, do raise your hand or raise a hand. And if you prefer to type, that's also perfectly fine. So as people are thinking, Ajay, let me start us off then. Sorry, there was something that's coming. So that's someone saying thank you, sir, to you, Ajay.
Anu, could you speak up a bit?
Yeah, I said somebody saying thank you, sir, to you.
Okay.
Okay, so let me just sort of, I'm thinking aloud because, there was a lot in the talk and it's not easy to sort of ask questions so readily. So let me take you back to the first part of your talk and think with the idea of the non. Right?
Of the
non, of the non-constitutive other.
yes.
Right? So that's a really difficult and important way to think about the constitutive outside, right? The non-human, the non-citizen, and so on. Right? Now, in many ways, there is something that is, it's also a signifier in very specific ways. For example, in Indian English usage, non-vegetarian. Right? We know what that non is referring to. Right?
Yes.
So there is something about, it seems to me, the way in which one wants to think about the non in this form. About, when you say that the neighbor is a far more labile concept. So what is it then that puts the neighbor in a kind of, at least, if not, since the, at the heart of this talk is also about questions about democracy and how we think about questions about, political democracy, citizenship, and so on and so forth. How do we put the neighbor, the citizen, and the human in some kind of a triangular relationship? Because you end with a large question, which is to do with the human, really. I mean, we have actually traveled very far away from the neighbor as defined within the kinds of parameters of this talk in thinking about climate change. Right? So how do we think about this triangulation when we think about the non as the kind of way of thinking the citizen or thinking the human? What happens when we put the neighbor back into this? I mean, is there a way in which we want to think about that? So that's just thinking aloud with you. That's just the first.
Yes. No, that's a wonderfully generative question, and I mean, as you know, that in a way the emphasis on the word non is important, partially because in this context, at least, right, and in Gandhi's context of non-violence, etc., the acknowledgement is that there cannot be a world without violence, right? So non-violence does not mean, so it's very suggestive, for example, that Gandhi picks on the word ahimsa rather than say shanti, right? Which would be peace, right? Because that would be a positive term, right? But that positive term is, in some senses, does not provide for Gandhi the purchase he would like, right? And this is partially because he recognizes a certain violence is involved in sovereignty itself. And at the same time, sovereignty is unavoidable for the kind of beings we are, right? So that is one. Then the reason I picked on the citizen and the human is because these are perhaps the most democratic forms of sovereignty available, right? I mean, we all know they're violent, so I don't think I need to, go into that here, right? But despite their violence, they are fundamentally attempts to expand the remit of who is included, right? So that the idea would be that if we could only practice citizenship in India, right, at least we would not have, the kind of violence, much of the violence that is there today, right? Similarly, invoking the figure of the violence would allow us to minimize some of the, invoking the human would allow us to minimize some of the violence we practice against refugees, for example, right? So that's why the language of human rights and citizenly rights is so important, right? So in a way, I think the interesting thing about Gandhi's coming to the neighbor is that he comes to the neighbor at a time when the violence of the old figure of the neighbor is very, very evident, right? I mean, when Ambedkar says that, leave the villages, why is he saying it? Because the village, as he sees it, is a world where only that kind of neighborliness dominates, right? So, I mean, it's not as though the neighbor can be the historical neighbor, the phenomenology of the neighbor can be celebrated as such, right? Even the figure of the citizen and the human offers at least some liberation from that kind of neighborliness, right? At the same time, it's a very violent liberation because it's premised on sovereignty, right? And I think that's the context in which Gandhi is trying to return to this figure of the neighbor to look, as I said, the reason I said the neighbor is very labile is because the neighbor does not have a criterion except proximity, right? Which is not a exclusionary general criterion in that sense, right? I mean, if I say I am a human, I'm also saying this being is not a human, right? And therefore I'm excluding this human. Whereas if I say I care for what is proximate to me, I am recognizing what is my finitude and beginning with my finitude in a way that does not necessarily exclude those who are afar, right? And that emphasis on the neighbor and neighborliness, it seems to me, has to be at the core of any effort today to also try and think of a democratic response to the crises we face, such as climate change, right? In a way that's not going to, again, revisit the old violence, right? I mean, sometimes I feel very glad that climate changes happened after colonialism. Otherwise, I don't know how much we'd have suffered, right? But still, I mean, as we know, it will be the most marginal who will suffer. And that is why I think this idea of the neighbor seems to me to offer also a way of expanding the conversation to include also, shall we say, the non-human as a neighbor, right? And to recognize that much more centrally. So
in a way, no, we will talk, because I think the question was so vague that, but you do address one part. So let me then ask you a more specific question, which you can respond to after some of the other questions have come in. So in which case, the suggestion seems to me that we are displacing to some extent, because both
we are, sorry, could you repeat? We
are displacing to some extent the kind of sort of contemporary focus on human rights and citizenship kind of discourses by trying to work with the possibility of what this neighborliness might do, because it's far more capacious in some senses, despite all the various kinds of limits that you were speaking about. Okay. All right. So let me take.
And that's why by democratizing it. Yeah.
Right. Right. I get it. Yeah. All right. Very interesting. All right. Lakshmi Subramaniam has a question. A profound conversation that would have been easier to respond to if one actually read it, which I agree with Ajay. A paper like this should have been pre-circulated. My specific question is how the idea of the neighbor in all its dimensions, othering, intimate, vulnerable, etc., evolves through his writing. How does one read this? if one looks at the way he treats the idea of the Muslim-Hindu neighbor during the 1920s, when communal tension spills out over music before mosques, and how that changes when he is addressing a prayer meeting in Noakhali and talks with neighbors. I know this is a historical question to your conceptual concerns, but I'm curious. Thanks for a great talk.
Yes, yes. No, I think that's a great question, Lakshmi. I mean, and one of the things that happens is that, I mean, it's very, very interesting when you look at the Khilafat movement, right? When, there is much more of a talk of, this is the moment when he tries to think of the Muslim as a neighbor who is equal, right? And with whom, therefore, there should a certain kind of surrender should be offered, right? And that is what he tries to do. By the 1940s, it is, I think, clearer to him that addressing the Muslim is also about addressing the Hindu, right? It's perhaps even more about addressing the Hindu. And I think that is maybe, if I'm to think on the fly, I think this is what I would stress is one of the key transformations that takes place, that, that it is not the Muslim who needs to be addressed as such, but it is the majoritarianism of the Hindu that needs to be addressed, right? And I think that's a very crucial thing that happens, which I don't think he recognizes in the same way in the 1920s at all. And so there is this, so there are, again, with caste, as you know, it's better documented, right? The kind of shift that's taken place. How he moves from a profoundly violent conception of caste to, to a moment where he says that, look, he's willing to see Hinduism itself die rather than have caste survive.
Yeah.
Right? So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, spot on. Thanks.
Yeah.
We have Sunny Mohan's question, which is, thank you, Ajay, for your wonderful talk. When you propose a history or sociology of neighborliness, friendship, and love, what are the challenges in historicizing them?
Well, Sanil, that's a great question. And I think it's, in a sense, I think as though I've only begun the process of historicizing them. It's clear that all of these are, especially when you're talking of political friendship, it's clear that political friendship itself becomes possible only at a certain historical moment, becomes conceivable only at a certain historical moment, after the emergence of political democracy, right? Because in a sense, political democracy puts the question of equality at the center in a way that neighborliness historically has not. When the concept, it is only after this idea of equality has been introduced, even if in ways that that political friendship must reject or must relinquish. It's only after that you can think of political friendship. And I would say that there are the challenge of political friendship would be that it is always deeply historical, right? Even in its enactment, right? Because there can be no way, as I was saying, there can be no way of institutionalizing it. One has to always think of what does political friendship mean in this specific context that I find myself in, right? And the other thing that I think should be absolutely clear is that to conceptualize political friendship is not the same as saying that all concepts of that, that it's not the same as saying that what Gandhi did is correct, right? I mean, I think one of the things we have to take for granted is that it provides at best a grammar, right? And this grammar has to be activated in different situations by trying to look at how to respond to a particular situation. And a history would have to therefore look at the ways that everyday interactions have proceeded amongst those who are trying to practice it, maybe consciously, very often unconsciously, right? So.
Thank you, Ajay. We will take one last questions. So if anybody has, since it's getting quite late here, and
I'm
my
so sorry.
colleagues are, no, don't worry at all. This is so wonderful. Thank you so much for this. And I wish our time difference wasn't such that we could have had you at a slightly earlier time, but my colleagues are here and, who are doing the technology part of this talk, and one should let them off soon.
Of course. Yes, no, yeah, thank you so much.
It's a one last pressing question. Please do ask that now. If you want to ask it to Ajay directly, please do.
Can I?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir, for this very, very thought-provoking lecture. And these are some of the concerns that need to be really thoroughly thought about. And thank you for this talk. One thing I'm not able to wrap my head around is the kind of vulnerability that the dominant must. The relation of vulnerability from the dominant to the dominated somehow still remains in the Gandhian framework. It still remains in the Gandhian framework in terms of its practitionary, its representation, it's what it asks to do the Savarnas or the Satyagrahis in that practices of becoming an untouchable in that sense. Which in a certain sense still maintains the there's a dialectic for sure in a relationship with the neighbor, and there's always a dialectic, but the point isn't the point is to sort of nullify or reduce the dialectic rather than to maintain the same categories of master and slave and work within it. To which I feel Ambedkar has something. His movement from annihilation to something like Maitri of the Buddha is what he hints at is a certain osmosis, if I'm not wrong, endosmosis within society. So there this dialectic seems to be limited to its very bare minimum as possible. Bare minimum is one of the things that came up in your talk also. So doing the bare minimum. So maybe the bare minimum is to maintain the difference, but still have a sort of endosmosis of power, which through, with the question of religion, it still remains. Is that can we say that or think more about it?
Yes. Thanks for the wonderful question. I would completely agree with you that, I think this, I was too quick in saying it, but what I was trying to stress is that Gandhi's answer to the question of how can the dominant offer moral reparation, political friendship to the dominated, that Gandhi's own answer fails completely, as I think D.R. Nagaraj shows that beautifully, right? When he says that in this, there can be only one hero, right? The dominant caste figure himself, right? So I completely agree with you there. I also agree that the general form should be that of political friendship. And I think here you've very rightly pointed to, Maitri, right? Which is again a term that, which is one of the parallaxes between Gandhi and Ambedkar, right? But at least for me, I'm not sure that, how is this, what would it mean for the dominant to practice political friendship with the dominated in the sense of, moral reparation that I was talking of, which is in addition to allyship, right? Allyship is only political democracy, and it's absolutely essential. When I say only, I don't mean to say that it's less, right? I'm just trying to say that it's not the same as Maitri, right? So the specific form that Maitri or political friendship should take in the sense of what the dominant can offer to the dominated, honestly, I think for me, that is one of the most vexing questions. And I don't have an answer to that, would be the most honest answer to your question. That is something that I think we have to really think about. And I'm sure maybe it's just a failure of my imagination, right? And I would hope to be able to answer it better in some future date.
I'm absolutely thankful to your talk, sir. I mean, there is so much to be studied and dealt with here. I think these differences should come up more often so that there's room for more thought. I'm really grateful for your talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ajay.
Thank you, Anu.
On behalf of the Kerala Council for Historical Research, may I say that I think everybody here is so happy to have heard this wonderful talk, to have heard you think with us about a figure and a political thinker who's actually so critical for our times, but being invoked in very different kinds of ways. And for me, what was really actually really important about this is that it did not head back into predictable ways of thinking about Gandhi and Ambedkar, and so there's a kind of way in which you have reconstituted their relationship by thinking about the kind of annihilation relinquishment relationship, both of which are so essential for our time. So I think there is something there too, which at least I will take away from this talk, but we all, I think, look forward very much to reading it. So go on then, get ready and start writing and finish it off. Get those books done very quickly.
Yes, I shall.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ajay.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to get your questions and to listen to everybody. And yeah, thank you.
Bye, Ajay.
Bye. Bye, Sana.